All right, now I'd like to make an in-depth, careful video on this subject, but I just don't have time. That's not really, even though this is obviously a show. Welcome to Illusions Exist, my show. And so, of course, I apologize so profusely for not making this, a really well-coordinated, scripted event worthy of the idea that I'm conveying. Behind me, you see these great animations of what it's like inside a cell. There's all these things happening, all these coordinated things. And so I'm just going to, we'll make other videos in the future, coordinated videos. This is just, basically what this is I have my own crazy scientific theory, just like Hythloday and Gary, with the difference of being that mine is probably, here's the little fellow that we're really going to talk about most, that mine's going to turn out to be true. All right, that's a motor protein. Let's just go back a little bit and see how that guy moves. Okay. All right. So to me, the issue is this. I'm trying to follow, what is life? Where does it come from? Where does this, can we, as a kid, everybody's like, you'll never figure that out. It's like, why not? It's material. It's physical. We should be able to figure it out. And so where's the mystery? Now, a lot of people say it has to be some sort of a clockwork. So that's it. We figured it out. No, it's like, we have to follow the strings on the marionette. So, for example, this protein here, this motor protein, I forget if it's kinesin or which one, and it's walking along a cytoskeletal tube, a microtubule inside a cell. And basically, and this big thing is it's hauling a big vesicle, and so this is the motor protein right here. And it's got its gripper, and it's got feet, and they swing around, and you saw, that animation of its behavior. Well, it's just like a rag doll on its own. It has to be controlled. How's it controlled? See, the thinking here is I'm following back to its source, control through the follow the strings principle of marionettes. So let's think about this with science that's all familiar to us. Human beings, when they're dead or even asleep, are pretty much rag dolls. So that's always an interesting thing, that dead weight versus just asleep. But anyway, we're just rag dolls. So it's moving like it's alive. Something's deciding what for it to do. And how do you figure out, well, let's trace that phenomena. What's causing that? Is it a ghost that just the shape of the body and holds it up? No, it's going to be through some sort of marionette strings. Now, in a marionette, there are really strings going up to the controller. In the case of the human body, we're all pretty familiar with how it turned out. One, it was the muscles. Figured out a long time ago it's the muscles. But then what's controlling the muscles? So the strings, there's the muscles, and then there has to be a string, starts to become a wire, a control, a communication wire. But it's still the string triggering the muscle action, and those go back to the brain. And then, and then we continue to, what part of the brain? Well, there's the motor function part that seems to be doing most of the muscle coordination. But of course, with life, that whole chain of events just leads us here to inside the cell. So what looks mechanical, like a clock, and what looks spirited, like a living thing? Well, the coordination of this protein to be a little robot also needs to be explained, and we can follow the strings there. Now, we know a little bit about it. We know that the motor, the energy, comes through the ATP and related chemicals, in which, through hydrolysis, through the injection of an electron from basically if you have a series of water molecules lined up just right, it can push an electron into the right point, break the ATP, release some energy, and that's where the energy for this motion comes from. In order for that to be a coordinated behavior like we're seeing in this animation, that has to be signaled very, like a robot brain, like a computer has to be signaling that. This isn't just a bunch of cams and gears, causing this kind of behavior. This is being triggered through something that we could call a computational process. Now, it has to have some sort of a controller, is what I'm saying. And the strings in this case are going to be the wires that go back to whatever process is causing the injection of these electrons or protons in some cases in just the right sequence so as to have this, walking protein rather than just drifting towards some gradient or something. Now those strings are going to be control wires, and we know they go out into the water. And in the water in the cell, which is not shown here, it's shown as clear, there's little micro electrical currents, like of one electron, of a series of, on that kind of scale. And where is the connector on the other side? That's the problem. How can there possibly be some coordinated sequence of water molecules? For example, if the DNA was the computer, how could the circuit through the water molecules go back to the DNA somehow inside this thing? There's like 500 billion water molecules on that scale. This is a big old area, and it's surely the DNA, and there's no sign that the DNA would be controlling it. Okay. Another clue to this is bacteriophages, which are parasites, viruses that are parasitic on bacteria that, and to a degree, I guess all viruses, but that inject their DNA. They identify the bacteria, usually very much targeted to a particular species. They inject their DNA into it, literally piercing the cell wall and of the bacteria and putting this DNA inside, and then the DNA starts replicating. In other words, it's able to use the machinery in the cell to boot up and start running its own program. Okay, so as we all know, this kind of thing shows that it is the DNA and RNA that are the programs. You can hijack a cell. So wherever the computational device is, it's not just on its own. Okay, now what I think, my theory at the moment, I think I've narrowed this down. What I think's going on, and I've been researching this as well, and after I started researching and I found out, there are scientists that are looking at this. I believe that through hydrophobic and hydrophilic locations on proteins, those are basically magnetic characteristics that either attract or repel water, and also because water is polar and these places are polar, they will cause the orientations of the water to be in a certain way. And what I think is going on is that the proteins in the proper entropic environment of inside a cell are it's like a very complicated magnetic shape that causes the water molecules to be arranged into basically a little computer, and it is those computers that are doing that are driving these motor proteins and things that look alive. And that is why when a virus injects DNA into that cell, that's like putting a disk in the drive. It's automatically booted, and the water computers are what's really doing the computational part of what the virus does to take over the cell. And I really don't see where else the control mechanism could be at this point. So how could you make water into a computing device? It's actually kind of easy to imagine in that here. I'll draw a little picture here. So you have the water molecule, and it looks like a Mickey Mouse, right? We all know that, and it really does, because that's where the hydrogens they fit in a particular place, because they're sharing electrons with the oxygen that already has some of its electron shells full. So you end up with a water molecule. Let's see, being like this, right? I have it on its side there because of what I'm going to draw next. Look, this is a green card. So when I do this, you see just the drawing. Okay, right? So with the computer, when you have a hydrogen bond, what happens is that little tiny, the hydrogen side, which if I recall is a little bit positive, is the little bit positive side, ends up lining up with pointed towards the oxygen of another water molecule. And I'll show you in a second how complicated these can get. Right, now the thing is, you can see how this bond, the lower guy, is pointing, right, the one of the small circles, which is the hydrogen, is pointing at the oxygen of another water molecule. Well, you can see how this guy could switch over. It could be the other circle, right? It could be this other circle. It could be this other circle over here that was pointed up and doing the hydrogen bond. So you can see how in a situation like that, that could be useful as a bit, right? Because these chains of water molecules, it doesn't really matter as far as making the chain. It's stable with either of those hydrogens pointing. And so if it's this way, it's 0. If this way, it's 1. Or the other way around, doesn't matter. The point is it has two stable orientations. And so if you have complex water, let's see, let me do this other thing here. What do they call them? Water. You get it. You just get all. You have to go. There's a scientist. You gotta watch out because of these guys. Because there's a lot of people that sell stuff and say their water has water clusters, and it's all bullshit. But here's a good example. Okay. So, for example, here the red part is the oxygen, the little white nubs, and you can see how there's various ways these things can, that are stable, that water molecules can go ahead and arrange themselves. And in some cases, you've got it where it could be in either position, and that could act like a computer memory. The fact is, a lot of scientists have gone through and simulated what kind of, this is a good article on it, what kind of shapes are actually stable. And I think, I forget what the maximum is, but it's hundreds and hundreds of water molecules can be in these arrangements. So inside a cell, we already know it's kind of a high pressure, it's a very packed environment, and very controlled, and they know from basically X-ray crystallography techniques. So they have these great computer-intensive techniques they're doing now. They know the water inside the cell is highly organized. And it makes sense because it's so dense with chemicals, ions, and polar and nonpolar molecules, that all of these molecules cause the water to be spinning around and getting in particular organizations. And I'm suggesting that those organizations are computational structures, and that's where basically the thinking of the cell comes from. Now, is it a quantum computer? Is it not? Well, there's some research showing that these could be quantum computers, but they don't have to be. I mean, you could make a regular classical computer with this as well, and it might be better in the sense that classical computers, you see, the computers, the silicon in our computers, it works by quantum effects. That's how you have the solid state stuff, but we have a classical computer built out of them. Why? Well, because the memory doesn't just randomly go different and stuff. So, right, there's problems with quantum computers. It's not necessarily better if these clusters turned out to be quantum computers, though that also could be powerful, because with just a few quantum bits, you can, and they have proven that these water clusters, which basically are on the microscopic scale, happen in regular fluid water. And when you freeze water, you're seeing, its crystalline effect. These micro clusters are basically the crystalline shapes of water. And so they have done some tests showing that, there's quantum mechanical effects. You can have, for example, these hydrogen bonds where it's in a superposition. It's not a set state. Which of those hydrogens is pointing and making the bond? And, so you could have. On the other hand, you could easily just have, a classical computing device, because, in a protein like this that I was showing you, the water molecules here would be very, very, very tiny. So, there's millions of them around here. And there's been some recent tests showing that there definitely are these highly organized concentrations of water in these locations that I'm talking about, based on the hydrophobic and hydrophilic nature of amino acids and all the proteins that are made out of them. So a couple things I've been looking into is, does this kind of coordinated motion ever happen outside the cell? I don't think so. From what I found, I can't see that it does. There's obviously a lot of proteins like enzymes and insulin and lots of proteins that flow outside of cells into the general bloodstream, for example, and just look like they're keys, or in case of enzymes, they have a certain shape so that when a certain molecule comes along, they just happen to break that molecule up. That looks more like what you call maybe regular, like there's not a computational coordination required like you have in a case of a protein, walking like that. And so plenty of proteins just work by, their complex chemicals. When they bump into other, atoms, molecules, they'll tend to have a certain reaction without there needing to be a tremendous amount of coordination. Unlike when you have DNA replication, or like what they're showing now is actually, I think, DNA replication. Yeah. And so how does that all get organized? Well, one thing I know so far is that the strings controlling this, the coordinated part of this, the why to go there rather than there part of this, it's water. Water is what's pushing those buttons. Water is the strings. The question really is only, well, where do they go on the other end? Do they leave the water, or is it just that the water gets organized in a way to do computation, which is what I think is the case. So again, just like everybody else's crazy scientific theories, except probably going to turn out true. Oh, comments before I leave. Jesus Perez, well, I hope he got over his anger at me before. Everything is probably energy in different forms or vibrations. Most humans now exist only in a fake matrix of false programs or false information. Well, sure, if you mean because we live in our psychological world, more than reality, but yeah, I agree with what you said there. I think we've proven that everything is energy in different forms. Jesus Perez. So human brain computer is broken. I agree with you about H2O. It's probably a great source of energy we have not learned to use yet. Yeah, there's a lot of science. It's kind of, thanks, Jesus. I'm glad you weren't all mad at me because of the last video or whatever. But, you might still be mad at me, but I'm glad your comments weren't all about that. Thanks for being on topic and whatnot. So the thing is, so I've been looking at this for years, and then recently I started thinking, I want to learn more chemistry, and then it turns out there's a lot of stuff has happened in the last 30 years since I was in college, and the animations are better, we understand the shape of things, and basically more of the mechanical parts of how things go, and we've had time to figure things out, and also the computation to run simulations. Geez, it's just going on to the next. Oh, there's an ad. Got a free ad. Great for you. Good for you. And what was I? Oh yeah, and there's a lot of science on this right now. People are scientists that don't necessarily, they're interested in life, though not always, but just regular chemists and stuff. The techniques are such that they're looking into the organization of water inside the cell, because separate from my little theory here, or my big theory, I'm gonna win a Nobel Prize, is that it definitely has to do with the organization of the water in there. And the fact that water, even in the lake, is not just a homogeneous randomness or anti-homogeneous randomness, or however you want to think of random, that there's basically little water clusters, which would be like snowflakes, but just of 100 or so molecules in the water. And sometimes it's like the game of life. Like, yeah, they break up as they run into the other water molecule, but because they're little magnets, they also clink, 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 new little water molecules take part. And so phenomena of a certain water cluster shape can go through the water while it's shedding water and once, shedding actual molecules on one side and gathering them on the other. So, and they know that kind of stuff is going. They know that the density of water is not consistent, that even though the water is pretty well packed, there'll be these weird gaps because the water, being these magnets, they do clump together. And, and they're believed to be very short-lived. Most water, by classical means of testing, would be very short-lived, these water, at liquid temperatures. Now, when you freeze the water, that's what you're seeing, is these clusters, right? The regular shaping of the water molecule. But in liquid water, you do the math and stuff, they would be just destroyed. They would only live, I forget whether it's nanoseconds or picoseconds. Some of them might live, part of a microsecond or something. However, there's certain situations where, of course, they could, be kept to survive. The shape could be kept longer, like they do when they're frozen. But there's situations where they'd be liquid, where that'd be possible in a very carefully controlled environment, like you have inside of a cell. So that's my theory, and you're welcome to watch as it gets verified over the next 10, 15 years. Like my theory that we'd find more and more quantum phenomena in biology turned out to be true. So, just saying. All right, yeah, Troy. So, hello to you too. All right, cheers. Talk to you guys later. Talk at you later. And to you if you show up and talk.